A year to the day after I burned that final stack of old voicemails and emails, I found myself standing under that blooming magnolia tree, barefoot in the grass, a mug of tea warming my hands. I'd just come back from recording the 50th episode of Burden to Bloom. 50 stories, mine and so many others, woven together by the same invisible thread. Family can lift you up, but it can also break you apart from the inside when love is replaced by control and guilt. And when you find the strength to name it for what it is, you don't just save yourself, you light a path for others. My phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sophia, the woman who'd emailed me months ago about her studio apartment. Hey Emma, just wanted you to know, I moved into my own 2-bedroom today. All mine. No cosigners, no guilt, no strings. And it's because of you. Thank you for showing me it's possible. I smiled so wide I nearly spilled my tea. That's what healing looked like. One decision at a time. One lock changed. One no. That meant yes to your own peace. That weekend, Megan came by to help me plant flowers under the magnolia. We knelt in the dirt, hands caked in mud, laughing like kids. At one point, she sat back on her heels and gave me a look. You know, she said, I still think about that note you left in the old house. Surprise, a burden did this. You realize how powerful that is. I shrugged, wiping sweat from my forehead. At the time, I meant it to sting them. Like, look what your burden can do. But now, I think it was for me. A reminder that the part of me they tried to keep small was actually my biggest strength. Megan nodded. Damn, right. A burden is just a weight you're carrying for someone else. And when you put it down, you get your own life back. The podcast grew faster than I ever imagined. It started with solo episodes, then interviews, then full panels with financial counselors, therapists, adult children who'd left behind toxic parents or partners. A local journalist reached out to profile the show. She asked, why share something so private? Weren't you afraid? I told her the truth. At first, yes, but when your silence only protects the people who hurt you, you realize that speaking up isn't just brave, it's necessary. Not everyone can walk away tomorrow. But if they know they're not alone, that changes everything. She included that line in her article. It went viral in a small, quiet way, not millions of clicks, but hundreds of messages from people who said, I needed that. I thought I was the only one. One late afternoon in August, I got a letter in the mail. Not a bill, not spam, a handwritten envelope with my name. I sat down on my porch steps, carefully tearing it open. It was from Rachel, my cousin who'd reached out once before but hadn't followed up. Her handwriting was neat and a little wobbly. She wrote that she'd finally moved out of her parents' basement. She'd opened her own checking account, blocked her mom from seeing her credit score, and was saving for her first solo vacation. She closed her note with, you were the first one who showed me you're allowed to say enough. I hope you know you changed my life too. I held that letter for a long time, sunlight dappling the paper, the magnolia petals drifting down around me. I didn't even notice I was crying until I tasted salt on my lips. By fall, the first Burden to Bloom community meetup took place in a rented library conference room. No big fanfare, just 10 people, coffee in mismatched mugs, and stories, traded like seeds. Some were just beginning to set boundaries with a sibling or parent. Others had left whole lives behind, jobs, marriages, cities, to start fresh. We cried, we laughed, we swapped recommendations for therapists and estate attorneys. And when the session ended, no one wanted to leave. A young woman lingered. As I packed up the coffee cups, she asked, does it get easier? Letting go of people you thought were supposed to love you. I thought of my parents, wherever they were, still telling their version of the story to anyone who'd listen. I thought of the holidays I spent with Leah and her family. The birthdays now filled with people who showed up without scorekeeping. It doesn't get easier overnight, I told her honestly. Some days you'll wish they'd just show up and say, I'm sorry. I see what I did. But the longer you stay gone, the more you'll see they don't get to define you anymore. And that makes all the difference. She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. Thank you, Emma, for all of this. As the new year rolled in, I stood at my window, fairy lights strung across the magnolia's branches. My life wasn't perfect. Some nights, the old ache whispered, you could have tried harder. Maybe you gave up too soon. But then I'd remember that recording. That phone call my father didn't hang up. The word burden flung like a weapon from people I would have bled dry to please, and I'd whisper back, no more. My grandmother's voice still guides me. Protect what's yours, Emma, especially your peace. Especially your heart. I'd learned that family isn't the people who share your last name, it's the people who sit with you in the dark, hand you a flashlight, and remind you you're allowed to lock the door. And sometimes, you don't just lock the door, you build a new house entirely, one with stronger walls, open windows, and no room for ghosts who don't deserve your warmth. If you're watching this and my story feels like yours, I hope you remember this. You are not selfish for wanting to be safe. You are not cold for wanting to be free. And you are not a burden for choosing your own peace over someone else's comfort. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to choose yourself, even when it hurt. Like and subscribe if you want more stories of quiet strength and loud freedom. And share this with anyone who's still carrying a weight that isn't theirs to hold. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you'll ever do is put it down, and walk away lighter than you've ever been. Thank you for being part of my story. Here's to yours. End of part 16. The spring after that last visit to my grandmother's grave, I hosted the biggest workshop Burden to Bloom had ever put together. We'd partnered with a local community center and a financial literacy nonprofit to offer a day-long event. Boundaries and budgets, how to protect yourself when family crosses the line. It was surreal, standing on the small stage in a sunlit hall, looking out at dozens of people, young, old, married, single, all gathered because they'd felt what I once felt. That stomach knot of obligation mixed with dread. As I stood behind the podium, I saw Luis in the second row, notebook in hand, beaming. Aunt Judith was there too, sitting next to Megan, both of them waving when they caught my eye. When the applause died down, I took a breath. I want to start today with the thing nobody tells you, I said. The people who drain you the most are sometimes the ones who share your DNA. And it's okay to admit that. It's not disloyal. It's not cruel. It's honest. Heads nodded all around the room. I could see the weight lifting just from someone saying it out loud. After the session, people lined up to talk to me. A woman in her 60s hugged me tightly and whispered, "My son keeps draining my retirement." I thought I was a bad mother for saying no, but maybe I'm not. A young man, maybe 20, looked down at his shoes and said, "My parents took out credit cards in my name. I didn't even know that was fraud until I heard your podcast. Thank you for telling people it's okay to protect themselves." Each story reminded me why I'd chosen to share my own, unpolished and painful as it had been. Every time someone saw their experience reflected in mine, it was like pulling another stone out of that river of shame we'd all been swimming in alone. Later that evening, I stood in the empty hall with Aunt Judith and Megan. We stacked chairs, leftover snacks, boxed up for donation. "You know," Aunt Judith said, wiping down a folding table, "Elizabeth would have loved this. Seeing you help people stand on their own 2 feet. Megan smirked. She'd probably be right here running the sign-in table, glaring at anyone trying to sneak in without paying. I laughed, picturing my grandmother with her crisp blouse and nonsense expression, guarding the door like the gatekeeper of self-respect. "I think she'd be proud," I said. "Not just of this, but of me." Aunt Judith came over and squeezed my shoulder. "She absolutely would." When I got home that night, exhausted but buzzing with a kind of hope I hadn't felt in years, I curled up on my sofa with my laptop. I opened the Burden to Bloom inbox, which had once been empty but now overflowed with people sending stories, questions and confessions. One email caught my eye. The subject line simply said, "Your story helped me leave." It was from a woman named Sophia, who explained how she'd grown up in a family that treated her bank account like a community chest. She'd been paying her brother's rent for 4 years, covering her mother's overdue credit cards, co-signing loans she knew would never be paid back. But she'd heard my episode about the difference between love and obligation and something clicked. She moved out, closed the shared accounts, and set a clear boundary. "If you want me in your life, it won't be through my wallet." At the end of her email, she wrote, "I know you don't know me, but I want you to know I'm sitting in my tiny studio apartment tonight, eating noodles on the floor. And I have never felt so free. Thank you, Emma, for showing me I'm not selfish. I'm safe." I sat there for a long time after reading it, letting her words sink in. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about finally feeling safe in your own life. 1 week later, I got another unexpected message, this one from cousin Rachel. She'd stayed neutral through everything, never taking sides openly. Though I knew she'd heard plenty from my parents. Her email was short. "Hey Emma, I just want you to know, I see you. I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. Mom told me they're still complaining about you stealing the family home. But I know the truth. If you ever want to grab lunch, I'd love to catch up. I didn't know if I was ready for that, but I smiled anyway. Because every time the truth rippled out, it made it harder for the lies to stick. Spring turned into summer. And the new magnolia I'd planted in my front yard bloomed, bigger than ever. One evening, I sat on my porch, feet propped on the railing, watching the petals drift down like confetti on the fresh grass. Aunt Judith called me, just then, her voice bright with news. "You're going to laugh," she said. "Your father tried to come to my house yesterday. He wanted me to talk to you for him, told me you were still being dramatic and that you should come home." "Home," I repeated, shaking my head. That house was never my home, it was Grandma's, and now, I have my own. "That's what I told him," Aunt Judith said. "I told him you'd built something so much bigger than any house. You built a life that doesn't need his permission slip." I let out a small laugh, one that felt lighter than anything I'd carried before. Some nights I still wondered if they'd ever understand what they lost. Not the house, not the money, but me. The daughter who would have done anything for them until she learned that anything would never be enough for people who see you as an ATM with feelings. And then I'd remind myself, I didn't leave them. They let me go when they made my love a transaction instead of a gift. I closed my eyes on that porch, the magnolia scent sweet in the warm air. In that small, ordinary moment, I felt my grandmother's presence as clearly as if she were right beside me. I imagined her saying what she always did. "Protect what's yours, Emma, especially your peace." It was nearly a year and a half since I'd sold the house when the final sign arrived that my parents hadn't changed. Not one bit. It came in the form of a letter, sent not to me but to my broker's office, the one address they still had on file from my real estate license. The receptionist scanned it and forwarded it to me with a note. "Thought you'd want to see this, looks important." My hands didn't even shake as I opened the PDF. It was a neat, typed page on some generic letterhead. In it, my father explained that they were formally requesting reconciliation and proposing a plan to re-establish family harmony, which, unsurprisingly, included me purchasing a suitable home for them so they could recover from the traumatic loss of my grandmother's property. It read like a business memo. Not a single word about the betrayal, the manipulation, or the conversations I'd overheard that had cracked my world wide open. Just demands disguised as polite legalese. At the bottom, a final line. "We hope you will come to your senses before it's too late." I sat back in my chair, almost laughing. Come to my senses. If only they knew how clear-headed I felt now. I forwarded it straight to my attorney, Patricia, with a short note. More of the same. Just documenting. Her reply came back a few minutes later. No legal standing. As always, do not respond. I didn't. I wouldn't. I had learned that silence can be the strongest boundary you'll ever set, because some people need your reaction to survive. Denying them that was the final line they couldn't cross. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the tiny moments that had brought me to this version of my life. The click of the lock when I changed the keys. The rustle of moving boxes carried out of the house that once felt like a fortress and a prison at the same time. The taste of the coffee at that cafe where I'd faced them down, refusing to buckle one more time. But the memory that stuck with me most wasn't dramatic at all. It was the sound of my grandmother's laugh drifting through my old childhood bedroom when she'd sit with me on summer evenings, brushing my hair and telling me stories of how she'd built her empire penny by penny. "You protect what's yours, Emma," she'd say, "not out of greed, but because no one else will ever guard it the way you do." I didn't realize then she wasn't just talking about money. She was talking about peace, about self-respect, about the sanctuary that should exist inside you. Untouchable by people who only see what they can extract. In the morning, I decided it was time to do something with all the paperwork I'd hoarded, the old emails, the printed threats, the voicemails I'd had transcribed just in case. I carried it all out to the tiny fire pit I'd set up on my patio. It was still early, the sun barely cresting the rooftops, the air crisp and calm. I fed the pages into the flames, one by one, watching each sentence curl into smoke. The apology that never was. The threats that had lost their sting. The last attempts to make me feel small. When it was done, I stood there barefoot on the cool concrete, warm ashes swirling like confetti, and I realized something I hadn't said out loud yet. I was free. A few days later, I got a text from Luis, the young man who'd once confided that he was too afraid to stand up to his controlling family. He'd been one of my earliest podcast guests, and we'd kept in touch ever since. "Emma, guess what? I'm taking my mom to see my new apartment tomorrow. She's going to flip when she sees I did it all without her help, but she's going to see me living my own life. Finally, I grinned at my phone. That's what real freedom looks like. No permission slips. No begging for scraps of love with your bank account as the pen. I typed back, proud of you. This is exactly what growth looks like. Later that week, I did something I hadn't let myself do in years. I took a road trip back to my grandmother's grave. I hadn't been since the first year after the house was sold. Part of me worried that going back would feel like reopening a wound I'd finally allowed to heal. But it didn't. I parked my car at the far end of the small cemetery and walked the familiar path beneath the arching oaks. The wind rustled through the branches, the air fresh and clean. When I found her headstone, I sat cross-legged on the grass, a paper bag beside me. Inside was her favorite pastry from the tiny bakery she used to love, the same bakery she'd taken me to as a child when we needed a break from the house that was never quite as peaceful as it should have been. "Hi, Grandma," I whispered, brushing away a stray leaf from her name. "You wouldn't believe how far I've come. Or maybe you would, you always did see me more clearly than I ever saw myself." I talked for a while about the podcast, about the community we'd built, about the woman I was becoming. When I got up to leave, I left the pastry on the small stone bench beside her grave. A tiny offering, not of obligation but of gratitude. On the drive back home, I didn't cry. I didn't replay old hurts or wonder how different things might have been. I just drove windows down, music up, wind in my hair. I thought about the people I'd still meet, the stories I'd still help tell, the countless others who needed to hear that leaving isn't failure. Sometimes it's the bravest, kindest thing you can do for yourself. I thought about my parents too, but not with anger. Just a quiet acceptance that they'd stay who they were, and I'd stay gone. And when I pulled into my driveway, the new magnolia tree I'd planted out front was just beginning to bloom. Some burdens really do turn into gardens, if you have the courage to plant them somewhere new. By the time winter rolled around again, my life looked almost unrecognizable compared to the year before. I'd made new friendships, built a solid base for burden to bloom, and grown into a version of myself I never thought I'd get to meet. The version that didn't flinch every time her phone buzzed with a family number. Some nights, curled up on my little couch with a mug of tea and my laptop, I'd read messages from listeners who'd found the courage to say no for the first time. One woman had written, "Emma, last week I told my brother I wasn't co-signing his loan. He screamed that I'd ruined his life. But when I hung up, I realized I finally felt free." I bookmarked that email. Sometimes I read it when doubt crept back in, proof that sharing my mess had helped others clean up theirs. Proof that all the pain I'd carried was finally feeding something good. Around the holidays, Megan and I were grabbing coffee when she asked me something I hadn't let myself think about for a while. "Do you think you'll ever speak to your parents again?" she asked, stirring sugar into her cup, her tone gentle. I took a breath, staring out the cafe window at the people bustling past with their shopping bags and winter scarves. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Sometimes I catch myself daydreaming that they'll call to apologize, a real apology, not that manipulative half version, but then I remember who they really are." Megan nodded. "If they did apologize, would you trust it?" I gave a small laugh. "Probably not at first, but maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not about trust anymore, maybe it's about boundaries. I can forgive them from a distance if I need to, but I don't owe them the keys to my life again." She raised her cup in a quiet toast. "To distance, then, sometimes it's the best gift." One of the strangest things about cutting out toxic family is how quiet life becomes afterward. That constant buzzing anxiety fades, replaced by a different silence that can feel both comforting and lonely at the same time. The first Christmas in my new place, I sat on the floor next to my tiny fake tree, wrapping a single gift for Aunt Judith. There were no piles of presents, no frantic last-minute errands to buy something good enough to earn someone's fleeting approval. Just a thoughtful present for someone who loved me without scorekeeping. I still caught myself reaching for my phone, out of habit, half expecting a barrage of passive-aggressive messages. But there was nothing. Just me, a cup of cocoa, and the soft glow of twinkle lights in a home that felt completely mine on in early January. I got a call from a local reporter who'd attended one of my workshops. She was working on a piece about the hidden side of family financial abuse and asked if I'd be willing to be interviewed. I hesitated. Part of me still flinched at the idea of my parents seeing my name attached to words like financial abuse. But another part, the stronger part, knew it was important, so I said yes. The article came out 2 weeks later, featuring my story alongside others who'd been manipulated, guilted, or outright defrauded by the people who were supposed to love them the most. When I read the headline, "When Blood Costs More Than Money, The Hidden Crisis of Family Financial Abuse," I felt a rush of emotions: pride, sadness, relief. I thought about my grandmother. About the letter I'd found in her papers. The one where she wrote that she knew my parents would try to use the house for themselves. How she'd trusted me to stand up for what was mine, even if it meant standing alone. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I hope I'm making you proud." The next day, my phone lit up with an email. The subject line simply read, "From Dad." My stomach twisted, but I clicked it open. It was short, clipped, "Saw your story. Can't believe you'd air private family matters like that to strangers. I hope you're happy destroying what little was left. Don't bother calling." There it was, the old tactic. Shame, blame. Turning my truth into an attack. I stared at it for a moment, then hit archive. I didn't even feel the need to reply. He'd told on himself in one line that he'd rather keep it hidden than face what he'd done. And that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. In the months that followed, Burden to Bloom grew beyond anything I'd pictured when I'd first recorded that awkward intro episode. We launched a community forum, a resource hub for legal and financial guidance, and even partnered with a nonprofit that helps people escape financial entanglement in abusive family situations. One evening after a long day of back-to-back recordings, I got a text from Luis, the young man who'd stayed behind after that very first workshop. "Emma, just wanted you to know, I finally moved out. I got my own apartment. No co-signed loans, no guilt trips. I don't think I could have done it without your story." I sat back in my chair, tears springing to my eyes. Not tears of grief, but the kind that come when you realize your scars have become someone else's signpost for survival. Aunt Judith came to visit that spring. We sat on my new patio, the one lined with flower boxes bursting with magnolias. My little tribute to the house I'd once called home. She looked around, taking it all in, then turned to me with a smile. "You know," she said, "Elizabeth, always hoped you'd take everything she taught you and build something bigger, not just for yourself, but for everyone who needed to hear it." I swallowed hard. "I think she'd be happy." Judith patted my hand. "She'd be proud, Emma, and so am I." Sometimes, when people ask me how I managed to find peace after losing my parents, I tell them I didn't lose them. I let them go. And there's a big difference. They'd made their choices. I'd made mine. It's not perfect. There are days when old grief knocks on the door like an uninvited guest. But now, I know how to greet it, kindly, but firmly, and I never let it stay the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon that day, I glanced at the flowers, blooming bigger and brighter than I dared hope. Maybe that's the best part of it all, knowing that a burden, properly planted, can turn into a garden that feeds more than just you. And that's exactly what I was doing. The weeks that followed felt like a new season in my life, not just because spring had arrived in full bloom, but because, for the first time, I felt like I was living entirely on my own terms. I spent my days balancing real estate clients, the growing demand for my workshops, and the new podcast I'd decided to launch. Evenings were quieter now, phone calls with Aunt Judith, long walks around my neighborhood, dinners with friends who asked nothing of me but my presence. It was such a simple thing to be wanted, not needed. I didn't have to prove my worth. I didn't have to pay for my seat at the table. I just had to show up as myself. The podcast launch was a bigger success than I could have imagined. I called it Burden to Bloom, a name that made me smile every time I said it out loud. Each episode featured a story, some submitted anonymously, some told in people's own voices. Stories about toxic parents who drained retirement funds, about siblings who demanded endless loans that were never paid back, about adult children finally learning to say no. I didn't just share my own experiences. I asked questions. I connected people with resources. And I reminded every listener that they were not alone. The most surprising part, the messages I received in response. Emails from strangers who felt seen. DMS from people who'd never dared to put words to what they'd endured. One message read, "I thought I was the only one who felt guilty for saying no to my dad when he asked me to sign for a car loan in my name. I thought I was ungrateful. Your story made me realize I was being used, not loved." Every time I read those words, I thought of that night I'd sat frozen in my grandmother's house, holding my phone in my shaking hands, hearing my father's voice call me a burden. I'd spent years believing that word defined me. Now I watched it become the soil from which I helped others grow. I'd be lying if I said there weren't still echoes of the past. Some nights, I'd wake up to an old familiar knot in my chest, a ghost of that fear that I'd gone too far. That I was the bad daughter who deserved to be alone. But then I'd remember what Dr. Palmer told me. It's not your job to be good for people who are bad for you. I'd take a deep breath, get out of bed, make tea, and stand at my kitchen window, reminding myself of what I'd built since walking away. My home was calm. My friendships were genuine. My bank accounts were secure. My choices were my own. Secret conversations about draining my equity. No guilt-tripped phone calls. No keys slipped under the door for people who didn't respect me. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't even known I could have. One sunny Saturday, I invited Megan and a few of my newer friends over for brunch on my tiny balcony. We squeezed around a second-hand table I'd painted bright yellow, plates of pastries and fresh fruit balanced between mismatched mugs. At some point, we started swapping stories about the worst family favors we'd ever been asked for. The laughter rolled across my small patio and into the street like music. Megan raised her glass to saying no. The most expensive word we'll ever learn. We clinked our cups together. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my mimosa. If you'd told me a year ago that this is what my life would look like, small but sturdy moments of joy, real connections, and laughter that didn't come with a price tag, I wouldn't have believed you. A few days later, I got another letter from my parents. This one was thicker. 3 pages of carefully typed justifications, gaslighting, and a final offer that was, unsurprisingly, all about them. They wanted me to invest in a new house for them now that they'd lost mine, the house they'd never owned in the first place. In return, they promised they'd forgive me and let the past be the past. Reading it was like opening an old wound, but instead of bleeding, I felt nothing but clarity. They hadn't changed. They probably never would. And it wasn't my job to teach them how. This time, I didn't even bother to shred the letter. I folded it up, tucked it into an old shoebox labeled "Do Not Reopen," and slid it to the back of my closet. Not because I needed to hold on to the words, but as a reminder that I'd finally learned to stop letting them define me. Aunt Judith called again not long after. She'd been going through more of my grandmother's things and found an old recipe box, filled with handwritten cards for every meal I'd ever eaten at her table. I laughed when I flipped through them notes. In the margins, like "Add extra sugar for Emma, she likes it sweeter." Judith smiled at me across her kitchen counter. "Your grandmother knew exactly who you were. She loved you for it, not in spite of it." It struck me then that the people who love you right don't try to rewrite your story to suit their needs. They don't call you a burden for needing help. They don't keep score or hang love over your head like a prize you have to buy. They just show up with your favorite sweet tea, with a phone call that says, "I found this old box and thought of you." They see you as you are, and they stay. Sometimes people ask me if I regret walking away. I always tell them the same thing. I don't regret protecting my peace. I only regret how long it took me to believe I was worth protecting in the first place. That fall, I was invited to speak at a national conference for women in business. Standing backstage, I glanced at the small charm I now wore on a chain, a tiny silver magnolia. A nod to my grandmother's beloved garden at 1842 Magnolia Drive. When I stepped out onto that stage, I didn't see a burden anymore. I saw a woman who had learned the cost of saying yes when you really mean no. A woman who knew the value of closing doors that only opened for people who came to take. And when I shared my story that day about the house, the betrayal, the note on the counter, the whole room was silent, leaning in like they already knew they could be next. I ended with the line that had become my promise. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by whether they water you or drain you. Choose the people who help you grow. Backstage afterward, one of the event organizers pressed a note into my hand. Inside, written in looping cursive, were just 4 words. A burden. I smiled as I read it, hearing my own voice echo back. No shame, no guilt, just truth and pride. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected message. It was a short, clipped email from my mother. No greeting, no warmth, just a statement. "We need to talk. It's time to fix this, call me." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed my laptop without replying. Dr. Palmer's voice echoed in my head. Not every invitation is worth accepting. I'd worked too hard to get this piece to walk back into the same trap, and yet, a familiar tug of guilt pulled at me. Maybe they'd changed. Maybe there was something left to salvage. I knew better, but old wounds can itch even when they're healing. I brought it up at my next therapy session. Why do I still feel like I owed them something? I asked Dr. Palmer, exasperated. I know what they did. I know they don't see me as anything more than a wallet. So why does part of me still want to call her back? She smiled in that calm, infuriating way of hers. Emma, your mind knows. They've shown you who they are. But your heart still remembers who you wanted them to be. She let that settle before adding, grief is complicated when you lose people who are still alive. It was such a simple sentence, but it stuck to my ribs like a heavy meal. I'd been grieving people who hadn't died, just the idea of them. The dream that someday they'd wake up, look at me, and see my worth without needing me to pay for it. After that session, I drove straight to the little park near my apartment. The sun was setting, the sky streaked with pink and gold. I found an empty bench and just sat there, breathing in the cool air. I thought about the last voicemail I'd saved from my father. The one where he called me ungrateful. How many times had I replayed that line in my head, letting it shape who I believed I was? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the recording. My finger hovered over the file. Then, with one quick tap, I hit delete. A quiet exhale left my chest. I didn't need that echo anymore. At work, the momentum kept building. The workshops were now booked out 2 months in advance. People came up afterward to share their stories, each one reminding me that I hadn't been alone. I'd just felt alone. One Saturday, a young man named Luis stayed behind after everyone else had left. He was probably 25, with shy eyes and a notebook full of scribbles. Emma, he said, can I ask you something personal? Sure, I said. What's on your mind? He hesitated, chewing on his lip. How did you get over the fear that they'd never forgive you? I studied him for a moment. Do you want their forgiveness or do you want your freedom? He looked stunned, like the thought had never crossed his mind. I thought they were the same, he admitted. I shook my head. Sometimes, forgiving yourself means accepting they might never forgive you, and being okay with that. Luis nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Before he left, he whispered, thank you for saying that. I didn't know how much I needed to hear it. I was driving home that night when I realized just how much I needed to hear it too. Saying those words to someone else cemented them for me, like repeating a promise I was making to the version of myself who had once been afraid to choose her own freedom. Spring turned into early summer, and with it came unexpected blessings. I'd been invited to speak at a local women's conference, the biggest event I'd ever done. Standing backstage, waiting to go on, I thought about the terrified girl who used to stand outside her parents' bedroom, eavesdropping on conversations, praying to hear something, anything that sounded like unconditional love. Now, here I was, about to stand in front of hundreds of people, not begging for acceptance but offering it to everyone in that room who needed to be reminded that they could break their own cycles too. I opened with my story. Not the edited version I used to tell, but the real one. I told them about the house, the phone call, the overheard betrayal, the note I'd left on the counter. Surprise, a burden did this. There was an audible gasp from the audience. Good. They needed to hear how ugly it can get, because sometimes the ugly truth sets you free. When I finished, a woman in the back stood up. Her voice trembled as she asked, but what if you can't just leave? What if the people you need to protect yourself from are your parents and you still love them? I took a deep breath before answering. You don't stop loving them overnight, I said. And you don't have to. But you do have to ask yourself, does loving them mean you must keep losing pieces of yourself? Love that requires you to disappear is not love, it's control. I saw tears on faces around the room. Some heads nodded. Others just looked down at their laps, holding that truth in shaky hands. Afterward, I stood at the exit while people filed past, some squeezing my arm, others whispering thank you like it was a confession. One woman handed me a folded note. Later, when I opened it, I read, I didn't know I was allowed to say no to my mother. You showed me I am. Thank you for reminding me, I'm worth saving. I held that note to my heart and thought, Grandma, you were right. The hard things we learn become the light for someone else. Later that week, Aunt Judith called. Emma, you should come by this weekend, she said. I found something else of your grandmother's, a stack of old journals. I think you'd like to see them. So, That Sunday, I sat cross-legged on Aunt Judith's living room floor, thumbing through pages of my grandmother's looping handwriting. She'd written about raising my father, her regrets, her hopes, her disappointments. In one entry, she'd written, "Some lessons you can't teach your children because they refuse to learn them, so you plant them in your grandchildren. Instead, maybe they'll bloom there." I closed the journal and smiled through my tears. I wasn't just the grandchild who'd gotten the house. I was the garden she'd planted her best seeds in, the one she trusted would grow in ways her own children never did. That night, back in my apartment, I made tea and sat with my laptop open. An idea was growing bigger than the workshops, bigger than just local talks. I started drafting a proposal for a podcast, real stories, real boundaries, real family, a place for people to share how they'd freed themselves from financial manipulation, toxic family ties, or generational debt disguised as loyalty. Maybe my parents would never know what I'd built. Maybe they'd never believe a burden could do all this. But it didn't matter. I was no one's burden now. And I was just getting started. In the weeks after I read my grandmother's letter, I noticed something subtle but powerful shifting inside me. It was like an invisible thread tying my past to my present had finally loosened, not broken, just released enough that I could breathe again. I spent a lot of evenings on my balcony, mug of tea in hand, watching the sun set behind the rooftops. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and remember the garden at Grandma Elizabeth's house, the smell of fresh soil, the way she'd hum to her flowers like they were old friends. For a long time, I'd worried that selling that house meant I'd lost her too. But now, sitting in my own place, free of the heavy energy my parents brought into it, I realized she was still with me. Not in the bricks and floorboards, but in the way I made choices that honored myself. In the way I protected what I'd worked for. In the way I held my own keys now. One afternoon, a letter arrived at my new address, forwarded by a cautious coworker who'd recognized my parents. Handwriting on the original envelope, inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no sign-off, just my father's cramped script. "I hope you're happy with what you've done. You'll regret this one day when you have no family left to turn to." I stood at my kitchen counter, reading it twice. Then I set it down, walked to my shredder, and fed it through the blades without ceremony. Dr. Palmer called that the moment you realize you don't have to hold their words anymore. She was right. I didn't owe them any more space in my head. They could keep their bitterness. I had better things to build. Work was busier than ever. The workshop series had expanded from once a month to twice a month, and now even local schools were asking if I could come talk to young adults about healthy financial boundaries. Sometimes I'd stand at the front of a small auditorium, looking out at those nervous, curious faces, and see echoes of my younger self, the girl who wanted to believe her parents were right. That loyalty meant sacrifice, that love meant debt. It was surreal, really, how a girl who'd once been too afraid to say no could now stand in front of a room full of strangers and say it with her whole chest. No is not selfish. No is not betrayal. No is sometimes the most loving word you'll ever say to yourself. One night after a session, I lingered in the empty meeting room, stacking chairs and clearing coffee cups. A woman named Janelle approached me, her arms wrapped around her sweater like a shield. She was in her late 20s, with the same weary look I'd worn for years. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Of course." I pulled out a chair, and she sat down across from me. She told me about her older brother, how he'd moved in temporarily 5 years ago after losing his job. How he'd never paid rent, never helped with bills, and always had an excuse. How every time she'd hinted that he needed to stand on his own feet, her mother would call her heartless, reminding her, family helps family. I listened, feeling every word in my bones. "Do you think I'm wrong for wanting him to leave?" she asked, voice trembling. "He's my brother." I reached for my water bottle to buy myself a second. "Janelle," I said gently, "what if you asked me that same question, but replaced brother with roommate? What would your answer be then?" She blinked, her eyes filling. "I'd have kicked him out years ago." "Exactly. Family should add to your life, not drain it. Love isn't real if it only works one way." She sniffed, nodding. "So I'm not a bad person." "You're a good person setting a hard boundary," I said. "Those two things aren't opposites. They belong together." When she left that night, she hugged me so tight I could feel her shoulders unclenched just a little. On my drive home, I replayed that moment in my head. I thought about how many times I'd wished for someone to say those words to me. When I was stuck in the quicksand of obligation and guilt, I couldn't go back and save that younger version of me. The girl who paid for family trips she wasn't even invited on, who worked late hours to cover her parents' emergencies, who lay awake at night wondering if she was just selfish for wanting to keep what she'd earned. But I could stand up for her now. Every time I spoke that truth out loud, for someone else, it wasn't just strangers, either. People I hadn't spoken to in years started reaching out, friends from college, old neighbors, even a cousin who'd stopped talking to my parents years before I did. My cousin, Sarah, called one Saturday morning while I was reorganizing my pantry. She lived 3 states away, but I could tell immediately from her tone that she'd seen the magazine article. I just wanted to say, "Good for you, Em," she said. "I remember what your dad used to say about me when I stopped giving him money. He told everyone I was ungrateful and disrespectful. I spent years wondering if he was right." I leaned against my counter, phone pressed to my ear. "And now, I'm free," she said simply. "And watching you finally stand up for yourself made me feel less alone. Thank you for that." We promised to visit each other soon, no obligations, no strings. Just 2 grown women choosing each other instead of tolerating family that only knew how to take. Aunt Judith visited too. We sat on my new couch, eating takeout Thai food off paper plates. She told me stories about my grandmother I'd never heard, the rebellious years, the tough love, the quiet moments when she'd confided her regrets about enabling my dad too long. "She always knew you'd break the cycle," Aunt Judith said, squeezing my hand. I wanted to believe that, and maybe, for the first time, I did. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying her words. Break the cycle. It didn't feel like a curse anymore. It felt like an inheritance that was finally worth keeping. Because when you break the cycle, you don't just save yourself. You make it possible for everyone after you to grow something better in the space you left behind. I visited Aunt Judith on a chilly Sunday in February. She still lived in the little brick cottage she'd shared with my grandmother when they were girls, long before either of them got married. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books. It felt safe, not in the suffocating way that my parents' house had always felt, but safe like a warm blanket on a stormy day. She welcomed me in with a tight hug, her silver hair brushing my cheek. "Emma," she said, pulling back just enough to look me in the eyes. "I've been hoping you'd come." I laughed softly. "You make it sound like I've been gone for years." "In some ways, you have," she said gently, leading me into the kitchen. "When you're wrapped up in surviving certain people, it can feel like you disappear for a while. I'm glad you're back." Over tea and slices of homemade apple pie, she asked me about the workshops I'd been teaching. When I explained how it had grown from a handful of curious attendees to packed Saturday mornings with people bringing friends, she smiled. "Your grandmother would love that," she said. She used to say, "If you're lucky enough to learn something the hard way, you owe it to the next person to make it easier for them." That made me laugh. She did say that, didn't she? Usually after dealing with my dad's latest get-rich-quick scheme. Aunt Judith gave me a knowing look. She saw him clearly. "I wish you hadn't had to learn the same lessons, the same hard way, but look at you. You didn't let it make you bitter." I shrugged. "Some days I feel bitter, but mostly, I feel free." She reached over and squeezed my hand. That's the part she'd be proud of. Before I left, Aunt Judith handed me a box she'd been keeping in her attic. It was dusty, tied with an old satin ribbon that had faded from deep blue to almost gray. "What's this?" I asked. "A few things your grandmother kept. Letters, little mementos. She always meant for you to have them when you were ready." I hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready now." Aunt Judith just patted the box. "Take your time. Some stories feel different when you see them through clear eyes." I held the box on my lap the entire drive back to my apartment, the weight of it strangely comforting, like a final gift from the woman who'd taught me that love should build you, not break you. When I got home, I put the box on my bookshelf, unopened. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed answers from the past to know who I was in the present. Spring came early that year. I found myself spending more time outside, long walks in the park, coffee on my balcony, afternoons at open houses for clients who reminded me of myself just a few years ago. More than once, I met young couples or single women ready to make their first big investment, and I could hear the echoes of my own fear and their questions. What if I can't handle it alone? What if my family thinks I'm being selfish for doing this my way? I told them the same thing I told myself every morning. Your peace is worth protecting. Your success doesn't belong to anyone but you. It felt like planting seeds in other people's gardens, seeds I knew would grow, even if I never saw the flowers bloom. One rainy Saturday, after a particularly powerful workshop, a woman named Carla stayed behind as everyone else filed out. She looked nervous, clutching her tote bag to her chest. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Do you ever regret it?" I knew what she meant. I didn't have to ask. "Regret walking away?" I asked, clarifying anyway. She nodded. "I keep thinking, what if I'm overreacting? What if someday I wish I'd just tried harder?" I took a slow breath, remembering all the nights I'd sat alone, wondering the same thing. "I don't regret saving myself," I said. "I regret how long I thought I could save people who didn't want to be saved. I regret how much of my life I spent proving I was worthy of love I'd never get unconditionally." Carla's eyes filled with tears. "That's what I'm afraid of, that it'll always feel unfinished." "It will," I admitted. "But unfinished isn't the same as wrong. Sometimes closure isn't them changing. It's you deciding you're done, letting their choices define your life." She hugged me before she left. I locked up the office with my heart aching, not in a bad way, but in that bittersweet way that comes when you see your old wounds reflected in someone else's eyes. That night, I sat with the box Aunt Judith had given me. I opened it slowly, like I might startle the memories inside. There were old photos, my grandmother in her garden, grinning at the camera, her gloved hands covered in dirt. There were recipes written in her tidy, looping handwriting, stained with oil spots and splashes of sauce. There were letters, dozens of them, most addressed to my father, begging him to stop taking advantage of her generosity. But tucked at the very bottom was a single note in an envelope with my name on it. No address, no date, just Emma ink, her unmistakable script. I read it 3 times, the words blurring each time as fresh tears welled up. "My dearest girl, if you're reading this, then something in you knows it's time to protect what you've worked so hard for. People will try to tell you that you owe them what you've built. They'll make you feel guilty for holding boundaries. They'll make you believe you're ungrateful for wanting to be free. Don't listen. What you've built is yours. What you protect will sustain you. I trust you. I love you. You deserve a life that feels like yours." It wasn't a roadmap. It didn't tell me how to feel, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that some family ties are roots that nourish, and some are weeds that choke you out if you don't pull them. I put the letter back in the envelope and slid it into the front of my journal, a reminder for the next time I wondered if I'd made the right choice. A promise to the woman who gave me my start, and to the woman I was still becoming. And in that quiet moment, with the rain tapping against the window and the memory of my grandmother's words wrapped around me like a blanket, I realized something I hadn't before. This was the life I'd saved myself for, and it was only just beginning. As winter rolled in, the last remnants of the life I'd left behind seemed to fade with the leaves. The storage unit I'd rented for my parents' belongings was paid through the end of the year, a detail I suspected they'd conveniently ignore until the bill came due. I kept expecting them to launch some dramatic legal action like they'd threatened. But Patricia had been right. They had no claim to stand on, and the more they learned that, the quieter they became. I hadn't blocked their emails, but I rarely read them. Once every couple of weeks, I'd open my old inbox just to confirm nothing new had changed, then hit archive on their rants about betrayal, their pleas about being left homeless, their reminders of what I owed them. What they never said, not once, was "I'm sorry." Not for the manipulation, not for the threats, not for seeing me as an ATM with a heartbeat. If you'd asked me before all this, I would have told you that not hearing from them would be the hardest part. That silence would feel like abandonment, but now, that silence felt like a clean page. An unfamiliar, quiet room that, once I got used to it, I could fill with my own voice instead of theirs. In one of my sessions, Dr. Palmer told me, sometimes estrangement is the healthiest boundary. Sometimes, protecting your peace means choosing absence over constant harm. She asked me to make a list of what I'd gained by choosing absence. I thought it would be a short list, but once I started, the pen just kept moving. No more panic when my phone buzzed at midnight. No more gut-clenching fear when I saw an unknown number. No more justifying every expense or every hour I spent on myself. No more dread that my success would become someone else's leverage. I wrote at the bottom, peace costs something, but chaos costs everything. The week before Christmas, I got an unexpected email from Aunt Judith, my grandmother's sister. We'd spoken only a few times since the funeral, but she'd seen the article that local magazine ran about the financial literacy workshop I'd started hosting at my new office. The headline made me laugh. Local realtor teaches women to say no to financial manipulation, even from family. I'd hesitated when they asked to run my story, worried it might stir up drama, but telling the truth felt more important than hiding anymore. Aunt Judith's email was short, but it landed in a way that cracked my chest wide open. Emma, your grandmother would be so proud of you. She always hoped you'd learn to protect your heart the same way she protected her home. Thank you for honoring her by choosing yourself. Love, Aunt Judith. I read it 3 times before saving it in a folder labeled Keep Forever. A family member who didn't want anything from me, except to say, I see you. I'm glad you're okay. That was a gift I didn't know I'd needed so badly. Christmas itself was quiet. No frantic shopping to find gifts that would never be good enough. No tight smiles across a dinner table, waiting for someone to pick a fight disguised as a backhanded compliment. No checking my bank account at 2 a.m., trying to figure out how to cover someone else's vacation emergency. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve at Leah's family cabin, the same friend who'd opened her arms to me when my own family slammed the door. We drank hot cocoa, played board games, and took turns throwing logs on the fire until we were all drowsy with warmth and laughter. When Leah's dad raised his mug and toasted, "To chosen family, may they always feel like home," I felt something click into place. I didn't say much that night. But on the drive back to my apartment, I let myself cry, not because I missed what I'd lost, but because I was finally starting to see what I'd gained. The first week of January, I sat down with Dr. Palmer and told her my New Year's goal. I want to stop calling what happened just family drama. I want to call it what it was, financial abuse. And I want to help other people see it, too. Her smile was that kind of therapist smile that says, "You're ready." "You know what's really powerful, Emma?" she asked. "Most people who break these cycles spend years just surviving. You're surviving, but you're also teaching others to do the same. That's how you turn a painful inheritance into something that ends with you." It made sense. The workshop I'd started on a whim, just a few slides on how to spot manipulation in financial paperwork, had grown into a regular event at my office. More and more women, and some men too, started coming in, telling stories that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. Parents guilt-tripping them into co-signing loans they could never repay. Partners borrowing savings with no intention of returning it. Family members who saw every success as a resource to mine. I didn't have all the answers, but I could offer my story. I could show them that setting boundaries, even with the people who raised you, wasn't cruel. It was survival. Sometimes, when I spoke in front of those groups, I'd catch myself looking out at all the faces nodding along, and think, would Grandma recognize me now? Would she be proud of how I used the house she gave me? I'd like to think she would. Not because I kept the house, but because I let it go when it stopped serving me. Because I used what she left me to plant something new. I don't pretend the wounds are all healed, they're not. I still wake up some nights, the echo of my father's voice in my head, "She's just a burden." I still wonder if someday I'll run into them in a grocery store, I'll feel all the old guilt slam back into place, but then I remind myself, the difference now is that I know I have choices. I don't have to open my door, or my wallet, or my heart to people who treat my love like an unlimited resource. I get to choose who gets a key. I get to choose who stays. And so, one cold January evening, sitting at my tiny kitchen table with a mug of tea warming my hands, I drafted an email to Aunt Judith. I told her I'd love to come visit, not as an obligation, but because it felt good to connect with someone who loved my grandmother the way I did. Someone who knew what I was carrying and said, "I see you and I'm proud you put it down." Sometimes the people who teach you to love yourself aren't the ones you expect. And sometimes the greatest surprise is realizing you're allowed to choose a family who feels like freedom. In the weeks after that final phone call, I waited for the next storm. I thought they'd show up at my new apartment, track me down through old contacts, or ambush me at work. But nothing happened. Maybe they finally realized they had no leverage left, or maybe they were too embarrassed to explain to their friends why they were suddenly homeless. Either way, the silence felt strange at first, like I was holding my breath in a tuck-quiet room. But with each passing day, that silence began to feel less like emptiness, and more like space. Space to think, to rest, to figure out who I actually was when no one was draining me dry. My sessions with Dr. Palmer became my lifeline. I'd walk into her cozy office, sit down in that same faded blue armchair, and unload everything I'd been too afraid to say out loud for most of my life. One week, I told her about how I kept replaying old memories, good ones, like my dad lifting me onto his shoulders at the county fair, my mom brushing my hair on the porch during the summer. Part of me still wants to believe those moments make up for everything, I admitted, twisting a tissue in my hand until it nearly ripped. Dr. Palmer just nodded, her expression soft but steady. Emma, we're allowed to hold both truths. You can honor the moments when they showed you love and still protect yourself from the ways they hurt you. It's not either or. I'd never realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to force everything into neat boxes, good or bad, loyal or selfish. That day, I wrote in my journal, it's okay if it's both. When I wasn't in therapy, I was learning how to just be. I took walks through my new neighborhood, where no one knew me as the girl with the big house and the bigger burden on her shoulders. I spent lazy afternoons in a tiny coffee shop, reading books for no other reason than I wanted to. No self-help, no real estate market reports, just stories that made me feel something. One Saturday, I wandered into a local pottery class. I'd always wanted to try it but had never felt like I had the right to spend money on frivolous hobbies. My parents had trained me well. Every extra dollar should go back into the family. Every minute not spent working was selfish. But, as I sat at that spinning wheel, my hands coated in wet clay, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. I wasn't making something for anyone else. Not to please, not to justify my worth. Just a lopsided little bowl for me. It felt silly and sacred all at once. Of course, not every moment was easy. Sometimes, I'd find myself standing in the grocery store, staring at the expensive cheese section, hearing my father's voice in my head. We don't buy nonsense like that. Why waste money when you could get the cheap stuff? Sometimes, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced I'd made a mistake, that selling the house would come back to ruin me, that I'd pushed them too far, that maybe I really was ungrateful. And in those moments, I'd do what Dr. Palmer taught me. I'd pull out the old letter from Grandma and read her words again. You understand the value of hard work. You know how to build something that lasts. Never doubt that you deserve every good thing that comes to you. Each time, the guilt loosened its grip just a little more. 3 weeks after the house closed, I got an email from Marcus, the realtor who'd handled the sale. He just wanted to check in. He'd driven by the property to see how the new owners were settling in. They love it. By the way, he wrote, said they're planting a new magnolia in the backyard. Thought you'd want to know. I read that line 3 times. A new magnolia, new roots, new memories. The old house was gone, not lost, but transformed into someone else's fresh start, just like I was doing for myself. One evening, I sat down with my journal and tried to answer a question Dr. Palmer had asked me in session. If you weren't the person holding everyone else together, who would you be? At first, the page stayed blank. I'd spent my entire life being the glue, the fixer, the helper, the reliable daughter who paid bills and didn't complain. Who was I if I wasn't the responsible one who made sacrifices so everyone else could feel comfortable? But slowly, I started to write. I'd be someone who says yes to things that bring me joy. Someone who doesn't apologize for taking up space. Someone who buys the fancy cheese if she wants it. Someone who plants flowers for herself, not just to impress the neighbors. Someone who doesn't answer every phone call that comes demanding a piece of her. When I finished, I closed the journal and pressed my hand to the cover, like it was a promise. I'd love to say that's when everything fell into place, that my parents magically accepted my boundaries and faded peacefully into their own lives. But people like that don't change overnight, or maybe at all. Sure enough, the next week, they showed up at my old real estate office again, trying to corner my coworkers into giving them my new address. Jamie, my work friend, texted me afterward, "Your parents are here. They're making a scene. Don't worry. Boss told security to escort them out. We've got your back." The old Emma would have been humiliated. The new Emma just felt grateful, and a little sorry for the version of me that once thought keeping the peace was worth sacrificing myself for. I forwarded the incident report to Patricia, my lawyer, who gently suggested a restraining order might be next if they kept escalating. I wasn't ready for that, not yet. But it was comforting to know that, for once, the law was on my side, that my choices were valid, that I wasn't powerless. A few days later, I sat on my balcony again, this time with my pottery bowl holding a handful of fresh strawberries. I thought about Grandma, how she would have laughed at the idea that it took selling her beloved house to finally set me free. But maybe that was the point. She hadn't left me the house so I could be tied to old obligations. She'd left me the house so I could learn that nothing, not even bricks and mortar, was worth more than my peace of mind, and now, sitting there with the evening breeze on my face and the taste of strawberries on my tongue, I realized I wasn't waiting for the next storm anymore. I was learning, one moment at a time, what it felt like to live unburdened. The day my parents came back from Europe was exactly like I'd pictured it, at least from what I could piece together from the flurry of voicemails, texts, and even a few desperate emails that found their way to my old inbox. I wasn't there to see it, obviously. I was sitting in my new apartment, curled up in a blanket I'd bought just for myself. No memories attached. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching. I just sat there, phone in hand, waiting for the inevitable. It started with a missed call at 6:42 a.m., earlier than I expected. Then came the first voicemail. My father's voice, clipped, annoyed. "Emma, what's going on? We can't get in the house. The key isn't working. Call us back immediately." They must have thought it was a mistake at first. Maybe the locks had jammed. Maybe the key was bent. But an hour later, the next voicemail was harder, colder. My mother this time, Emma Marie Davis. "This isn't funny. We're standing here with our bags like fools. Where are you? Answer your phone." I could almost picture her standing there on the front porch, the neighborhood watching through parted curtains. The perfect facade crumbling. They must have found the note soon after that. Because the third voicemail, that one I saved forever. Just to remind myself I hadn't imagined the manipulation that was my father again. Voice low and dangerous, that special tone he used when I was a kid. And he wanted me to feel small. "We saw your little note. You think this is cute. You think you can just throw us out after everything we've done for you. You've made a huge mistake. Emma, call us back right now, or you'll regret it. No, we love you. No, why did you do this? Just blame." And a thinly veiled threat. I didn't answer. I didn't respond. I knew if I engaged, they'd find a crack to slip their poison through. So I did what my therapist, Dr. Palmer, had told me. I kept everything. Screenshots, voicemails, email, backups, proof that this was who they were and who I was done being controlled by. By sunset, the messages had turned to bargaining. My mother, in a shaky voice that I knew was more performance than pain. "Emma, sweetie, please call us. We don't understand what's happening. We can fix this. We're your parents. You can't just abandon us." I paused the message halfway through, because I knew exactly what would come next. The guilt trip, the reminder of every sacrifice they'd ever made, while conveniently forgetting all the sacrifices they'd demanded of me. I forwarded the final email to Patricia, my lawyer. She'd warned me they'd threaten legal action. And sure enough, buried in their scrambled paragraphs was the line, "We're talking to a lawyer first thing tomorrow. You can't just sell our house." Oh, you our house. The gall would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. Patricia's reply came back before I could even brew my coffee. "Let them try. You have the deed, the sale contract, the payment trail, and zero legal obligation to house them. They have no claim." No claim. 2 words that tasted like freedom. For the next few days, they tried every angle. They showed up at my old office, where, thankfully, my boss had already been briefed. They called mutual contacts, probably hoping someone would guilt me into answering. They even found a way to reach out through the alumni network from my old college. Like they thought a desperate group email would somehow shame me into letting them back in. It didn't work. Every attempt just reminded me I'd made the right choice. But the real test came one afternoon when I was coming home from the grocery store. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But some instinct made me pick up. It was my mother. She must have borrowed someone's phone to get past my block. "Emma," she said, her voice soft, that gentle, sorrowful tone that used to melt every boundary I tried to build. I didn't say anything. I just let her speak. "Sweetie, I know you're angry. I know you feel like we've used you. But you have to understand, we're family. Families fight, but they don't destroy each other. You can't just cut us out. Where are we supposed to go?" I took a breath, my heart pounding. Once, that question would have gutted me, the idea of my parents lost and helpless because of me. But I'd heard the recording. I'd read Grandma's letter, I knew exactly what they were capable of. You could have planned for yourselves, I said calmly. You had a choice. You chose to depend on me instead. That was your decision, not mine. She switched tactics immediately from guilt to rage. So what? You think you're better than us now? Living alone in some sad apartment? You'll regret this, Emma Marie. One day, you'll come crawling back. I didn't bother arguing. I just said, goodbye, Mom. And I hung up. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pace the floor. I sat on my tiny balcony, the hum of the city around me, and realized the fear was gone. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for the next demand, the next guilt trip, the next subtle reminder that everything I had, they could take away if they felt like it. They'd already lost the power they had over me, and they knew it. That was why they were so loud now. Desperate people always make the most noise. When I met with Dr. Palmer that week, I told her about the call. I half expected her to scold me for picking up, but she just nodded. Do you regret answering? She asked. No, I said honestly. I needed to hear it. Needed to know that it would feel like this. Like nothing. She smiled gently. Sometimes the only closure we get is realizing we don't need their words anymore. We need our own. I went home that day and opened a blank page on my laptop. For the first time since this mess began, I started writing a letter, not to them, but to me. A promise that I would never again trade my peace of mind for their approval. That I would trust my instincts when they told me something felt wrong. That I would honor Grandma's legacy by building a life that was mine. Free of strings, no more burden. No more bank account with a pulse. Just me, Emma Davis, owner of my own story. Driving away from that house for the last time felt like floating. I didn't even realize I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly until I reached the highway and my knuckles throbbed. There was no grand soundtrack, no cinematic shot in the rearview mirror, just the quiet, steady hum of my car carrying me toward a future I hadn't fully planned yet. My new temporary place was a furnished one-bedroom about 2 towns over. Nothing fancy, gray carpets, bland artwork, the kind of modern complex built for short-term business leases. It felt sterile at first, but I liked it that way. It was the opposite of Grandma's old house. No memories embedded in the walls, no ghosts peeking out from old family photos. For the first time in my life, my space was truly mine. Even if only for a while. The first few nights, I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a barrage of missed calls, texts, or emails. But I'd been smart. New phone number, new email address, new bank accounts, a firewall between me and their reach. I did one last scan of my old accounts each morning, just to make sure no one was trying to dip their fingers into places they didn't belong. So far, so good. It wasn't peace yet, more like the fragile calm after a hurricane, but it was a start. On the 5th night, I sat cross-legged on the rental's couch, a glass of cheap red wine in my hand, staring at the spreadsheet I'd made. I should have felt triumphant. The house was sold, the money secured, my parents' stuff safely stored, every box ticked. Instead, a wave of grief swept over me so strong it knocked the wind out of my lungs. I missed Grandma. I missed how simple it used to feel to belong somewhere. I missed the version of myself that still believed family could be trusted not to treat you like a bank account with a beating heart attached. I pulled out the letter I'd found while packing, the one Grandma wrote just weeks before she died. You understand the value of both money and hard work. I'm leaving you my home because I know you'll honor it, care for it, and use it as a foundation to build your own success, not as a crutch to avoid responsibility. Her words felt like an embrace I'd needed so badly. She hadn't left me that house so I could carry my parents on my back for the rest of my life. She'd left it so I could have a chance to build something better. The next morning, I made a decision. I was taking 2 weeks off work. No showings, no closings, no calls. I texted my boss with a simple, honest message. Family situation resolved. Taking time for myself. Back soon, stronger than ever. His reply was instant. Take the time. You've earned it. I needed to talk to someone who wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. So I called Megan, my college friend who'd never been afraid to call out my family nonsense, even when I wasn't ready to hear it. When she picked up and heard my voice, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. Okay, spill. Are they dead? Did you bury the bodies in the garden? I actually laughed for the first time in weeks. Close enough, I said. I sold the house. Moved out. Their stuff's in storage. They don't even know yet. There was a long pause, then Megan's gleeful shout, "Emma Davis, you magnificent badass, about damn time." I told her everything, the overheard call, the lawyer, the storage unit, the note. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she just said, "So what's next? And more importantly, do you want pizza and terrible wine tonight to celebrate your freedom?" "Yes," I said, my voice catching. God, yes. That night, over greasy slices and half a bottle of Pinot Grigio, I let myself vent in a way I hadn't dared to before. "I keep wondering if I overreacted," I confessed. "I mean, it was my house, but they were my parents. Maybe I should have confronted them first instead of what?" Megan said, cutting me off with a look that could slice glass. "Instead of letting them keep using you, Emma, they called you a burden while eating escargot on your dime. They plotted to manipulate you into signing your own house over. What exactly were you supposed to do, bake them a pie?" When she put it like that, the guilt that had been gnawing at my ribs eased just a little. She clinked her glass against mine. "Two burning bridges," she said, "when the other side is on fire anyway." The days blurred into a strange limbo. I checked my old email every morning, half dreading what I'd find. For a while, there was nothing, just quiet. They were still in Europe, spending the last of the money I'd funded, oblivious to the bomb waiting for them at 1842 Magnolia Drive. Every time I pictured them pulling up to the curb, luggage in hand, only to find the locks changed, the furniture gone, the note waiting on the kitchen counter, I felt two things. At once, a stab of sadness, and an electric thrill of freedom. By week 2, I booked an appointment with Dr. Sarah Palmer, a therapist who specialized in family trauma. Walking into that first session felt like admitting I hadn't just lost a house. I'd lost an entire fantasy I'd built my life around. I told her everything in one rambling breath. The decades of guilt, the constant financial obligations, the phone call that shattered everything. When I finally stopped talking, she asked, "Emma, what do you feel when you think about what you did?" "Relief," I said immediately. Then, after a pause, "And guilt. Lots of guilt." She nodded. "Let's start there." By the time my parents' return date neared, I was more ready than I'd ever been. No more sleepless nights wondering if they'd change. No more hoping for an apology that would never come. I'd done what Grandma would have wanted, protected myself, protected what was mine, and set myself free. Whatever storm was waiting when they found the empty house, I was ready. Because for the first time in my life, I knew one simple truth: I was not their burden, and I never would be again. In the days that followed, I operated like a woman possessed. I had never packed so fast in my life, not even when I moved into Grandma's house after she passed. Back then, it felt like a homecoming. This time, it felt like an exorcism. Every time I opened another closet, another drawer, I found traces of the slow, insidious way they'd turned my sanctuary into theirs. My mother's framed family portraits hung in the hallway, covering Grandma's watercolor paintings. My father's ratty recliner sat right in front of the fireplace, so out of place in a house full of antique charm. Little reminders that they'd claimed their corners, expanding their reach, one helpful improvement at a time, until they felt entitled to the walls themselves. And in the middle of it all, me, the good daughter, the doormat, the ATM. Never again. Marcus did exactly what he promised. Within a week, he brought in 3 potential buyers, all pre-screened, all looking for a home just like mine. No for sale sign in the yard. No open houses with nosy neighbors whispering about why Emma Davis was selling Grandma Elizabeth's beloved colonial. Just quiet, private showings with qualified buyers and a short deadline. I spent those days camped out at my favorite local cafe, nursing after cup of coffee and scrolling through listings for short-term rentals. Sometimes, I'd look out the big window, picturing my parents flying through the skies over France or Italy, sipping wine they couldn't afford without my bank account. Did they suspect anything? Of course not. They'd spent years training me to be the dependable one, the one who would never make waves, the one who would always put family first. I'm sure they thought I'd be waiting with fresh flowers on the kitchen table when they got home. Let them think that. The first offer came in 4 days later, below my rock-bottom number. Marcus didn't even call me about it until he had 2 more serious bids lined up. When he finally laid out the details, he sounded almost impressed. "You're about to sell this place in under 6 weeks, he said. That's pretty much a record. Emma, you sure you're ready?" I could hear the unspoken question. Are you sure you're not going to back down? But the truth was, the more I packed and planned, the clearer I felt. Every box I taped shut was another brick in my fortress. Every time I sorted something into the parents' pile, I felt Grandma's voice in my ear. Never let anyone tell you what you're worth. When I accepted the best offer, $915,000, cash, with a quick closing, I didn't feel a pang of regret. I felt relief. Was I leaving a chunk of money on the table by selling fast? Sure, but the real loss would have been staying, letting them keep chipping away at my peace of mind until there was nothing left. After the closing was locked in, I made a spreadsheet so detailed it would make an auditor weep with joy. Everything that went into storage was photographed, labeled, and tagged with the day and time the movers would pick it up. Their precious recliners, their heirloom china, their mismatched towels and knickknacks, all of it neatly boxed and ready for them to reclaim. When the storage unit was ready, I paid for 6 months up front and had the access code and instructions mailed to their hotel in Paris. I even included a kind note, short, polite, factual. Your belongings are safe and accessible at this location. Storage is paid until January. Please make arrangements to move them as you see fit. I read it back and almost laughed at how calm it sounded. If you didn't know the backstory, you'd think I was being generous by the final week. The house was nearly empty except for my grandmother's keepsakes, the ones she'd left specifically to me. I packed those into my car myself, no movers, no boxers left behind. And yet, as I stood in the center of the living room that last night, the same room where I used to curl up on the couch with Grandma and eat cookies warm from the oven, I felt a pang of grief, not for the house, not for them, for the girl I used to be. The girl who thought love meant saying yes to everything. The girl who thought her parents' approval was the gold standard of her worth. The girl who mistook manipulation for care. She deserved better, so I was giving her better by refusing to let that version of me run the show any longer. Closing day arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus met me at the title company office with the biggest coffee he could find. I was so wired with adrenaline I couldn't even sip it. The buyers, a young couple moving up from out of state, were polite and excited and blissfully unaware of the family drama that had unfolded inside those walls. To them, it was just a beautiful old colonial with a garden and crown moldings and a newly upgraded kitchen. To me, it was a battlefield I was finally walking away from. The paperwork was surprisingly simple. Sign here, initial there, one more signature to sever the last tie. When the title agent slid the check across the table, I felt something deep inside me unclenched like a muscle I hadn't realized I'd been flexing for years. It was done. I left the title company with a cashier's check in my bag and a note tucked into my purse, one I'd drafted a dozen times before settling on the right words. Back at the house, I placed it right in the middle of the empty kitchen counter, next to the sink they'd complained about. It read, "Surprise, a burden did this." No drama. No screaming match. No last-minute confrontation. Just the truth, printed in black ink, impossible to twist or rewrite. When they returned from Europe, smiling with souvenirs and fresh manipulation ready to deploy, they'd find an empty house, a note, and the locked front door that no longer opened to them. I locked the door one final time, dropped the keys through the mail slot, and walked away. No more apologies, no more explanations, no more permission needed. It wasn't just the house I was leaving behind. It was the version of me that let them live in my head for free. That morning, the internet became my lifeline. I went down every rabbit hole, legal threads, real estate forums, Reddit posts where people asked the same question I was too ashamed to ask out loud. Can your own parents steal your house? It sounds dramatic when you say it like that, but once you've heard your parents call you a burden while they're living rent-free in the house your grandmother left you, the question stops sounding so absurd. I read about boundary pushers, about financial abuse within families, a phrase I'd never dared apply to my life. Until that day, I would have said no. They're just overbearing. They mean well. They just have a hard time letting go. But the call had made it undeniable. This wasn't just controlling behavior. This was a planned heist, and I was the vault. By noon, my coffee had gone cold, but my decision had gone hot and clear. I wasn't going to wait around to be tricked, guilt-tripped, or manipulated out of what was rightfully mine. I needed real answers, not Reddit speculation, legal facts. So I called Patricia Winters. She's one of the sharpest family law attorneys I know. We'd crossed paths plenty of times at the real estate firm, but I'd never imagined I'd need her like this. When she picked up, her calm voice steadied my shaking hands. "Emma," she said, "tell me exactly what's happening. Start from the beginning." And so I did. the house, the overheard call, the years of family obligation that had turned into thousands siphoned out of my bank account. How my parents had planted their things throughout the house, like flags, on conquered territory. When I finished, there was a long pause. Patricia didn't do dramatic gasps or hand-holding. She did facts. That's why I called her. First, she said, I need you to understand this. The deed is solely in your name. Yes, yes. Have they ever paid rent? No. Contributed to the mortgage, taxes, major repairs. I laughed, but it came out bitter. Not a dime. Good, she said. Legally speaking, you're in a strong position. They have no claim to the property. There's no common law arrangement, no co-ownership, no written agreement. They're tenants at will, at best. I let out a shaky breath. So they can't just take it. Not unless you sign it over. And from what you've told me, they plan to pressure you to do exactly that. I was glad she couldn't see me clenching my jaw. I'm done being pressured. Then you have options, Patricia said. You can evict them. They'll get notice. You can box up their things and store them, but you must give them reasonable access. Do it by the book. That's how you protect yourself. I scribbled notes so fast I could barely read my own handwriting. Emma, she added gently, I know, this is painful. But from a legal perspective, you have every right to set boundaries. The only question is, are you ready to deal with the fallout? I stared at the pen in my hand. I thought about Grandma's voice in my head, the words, from her letter, never doubt you deserve every good thing that comes to you. Yes, I said finally, I'm ready. By the next day, I was in full-on strategy mode. I called Marcus the best agent at our firm when it comes to delicate, under-the-radar sales. He's the kind of guy who sells a house while everyone's still gossiping about whether it's on the market. I invited him for coffee, laid it all out. No sugarcoating. I need to sell my house, I told him, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. Quickly, quietly. No sign on the lawn, no public listings if we can help it. And I need it closed before they come back from Europe. Marcus raised an eyebrow so high it practically left his forehead. You're serious? I'm dead serious. You know you're gonna take a price hit if you want it off market, and that fast, right? I know. He tapped his pen against his notepad, studying me like I was an unusual specimen. Family situation. Family situation, I confirmed. And I want to keep it my situation, not office gossip. He nodded. My middle name. I've got 3 clients looking for exactly what you've got. Historic, colonial, good neighborhood, no renovations needed. I'll set up private showings by the end of the week. When I got home that night, the house felt different. I walked through the hallway where Grandma used to greet me with fresh-baked cookies. Past the living room where my parents' recliners sat like thrones. Into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd heard them call me a burden. It was mine. Every square foot, and it was time to take it back. I pulled out boxes and started the most cathartic inventory of my life. Everything I owned went in one pile. Everything they'd brought into my home, their old recliners. Dad's fishing gear in the basement. Mom's boxers of floral china she insisted would look better than mine, got tagged for storage. If I couldn't prove it was mine, it went to them. I refused to give them any excuse to accuse me of stealing their stuff. Each drawer I emptied felt like cutting a puppet string. And when I found the stack of Grandma's letters in her old desk, the ones she'd written to my parents over the years, pleading with them to be responsible, I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. She had seen through them. Next came the practical details. A storage unit under their name. 6 months prepaid. Access code mailed to their hotel in Europe, a little surprised to greet them when they got home. I changed my phone number. Opened new bank accounts they'd never be able to track. Updated every password, every security question. No more birthdays or middle names they'd always used to weasel their way in. And I found myself an apartment 2 towns over. Small. Furnished. Forgettable. Perfect. Because when they came back to their house, they were going to find out it never was. In the quiet moments, the guilt tried to creep back in, that same old echo. Family is forever. You owe them. Don't rock the boat. But then I'd replay that call. She's just a burden. She never kick us out. And my resolve would harden all over again. This time, the burden was theirs to carry, not mine. Never again. It was a random Tuesday afternoon in June when my life and my illusion of family finally cracked open. My parents were halfway through their grand European adventure. Instagram posts from my mother were a daily reminder of how much of my savings was funding their wine tastings, museum tours, and riverside dinners. I told myself they deserved it. I told myself it would be worth it to see them happy. Meanwhile, I was back home, juggling clients and listings at my real estate firm. That day, I'd spent all morning showing a fixer-upper to a young couple, and by the time I got home, all I wanted was a moment of quiet. But the kitchen sink had other plans. It was leaking again. The faucet was one of the few home improvements my father had actually done himself. Naturally, he'd never given me the warranty paperwork. So I picked up my phone and dialed his international number. It took forever to connect, clicks, beeps, then finally his familiar voice, echoing with just enough delay to remind me he was somewhere far away. Somewhere beautiful. "Hey Dad," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you remember where you put the faucet warranty? It's leaking again, and I want to call the company before it gets worse." I could practically hear his exasperated sigh. "It's in the den. Filing cabinet, second drawer, under kitchen. Why can't you wait till we're back?" "Because water is pouring into the cabinet right now," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "I don't want to have to rip out the whole bottom when it could just be a quick fix under warranty." He grumbled something about me always finding problems. In the background, I heard my mother's voice, probably telling him to hurry up so they wouldn't miss their dinner reservation. "We're about to head out, some fancy place near the Eiffel Tower. We'll talk later." "Okay, thanks, enjoy dinner." I waited for the click, the satisfying beep that meant the call was over, but instead, I heard a shuffle, a muffled clink of silverware, a swirl of background noise that told me he'd slipped the phone into his pocket without hanging up. I should have hung up. I should have pressed end call and moved on with my day. But some part of me, maybe the part that was already tired of feeling used, held the phone to my ear, frozen. "Who was that?" my mother asked, her voice clearer now. "Emma," my dad said, his tone flat, complaining about something in the house again. "The sink." This time, I felt my stomach drop. There was something in his voice, annoyance, sure, but something sharper, more bitter than I'd ever heard. "What now?" my mother asked, like the very idea of me needing anything was offensive. "Something about the kitchen sink. I swear, all she does is find problems. She acts like that house is hers." I blinked, trying to process that. It was mine, Grandma's. Will made it crystal clear. "I still don't understand why your mother left it to her," my mom said. "It should have gone to us. We were her children." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my heartbeat roaring in my head. My dad snorted. "Doesn't matter. When we get back, we're having a serious talk with her about our retirement. She needs to understand that house is our future. It's our security. She doesn't even appreciate it." My breath caught. Our future. Our security. As if I were just a placeholder for something they believed they owned by birthright. "She's always been a burden," my father added. "All those years of expenses, college, everything. And now she has this valuable property, just dropped in her lap. And she thinks she deserves it." I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but I couldn't move. My mother's voice cut through my shock. "She's always been selfish," she said, "but she's also easy to handle. Look how fast she agreed to pay for this trip. All I had to do was mention family." Their laughter, that familiar, synchronized laughter I'd heard my whole life, sent a chill down my spine. "We just need to keep working on her," my father said. "She's desperate for approval. Always has been. She'll sign it over eventually. Or at least add us to the deed. All we have to do is remind her how much we've done for her, and if she doesn't agree," my mother asked. My father chuckled. "She will. If not, we start bringing up nursing homes, medical bills. Remind her what family obligation really means. By this time next year, that house will be in our names." I realized then, this wasn't casual resentment. This was a plan, a strategy, a blueprint for how to squeeze me dry, and the worst part. They were right, I had always been desperate for their approval. I'd always bent over backwards, convinced that if I just did more, gave more, they'd love me unconditionally. They kept talking about what they'd do when they moved into the master bedroom, about how they'd redecorate, repaint, renovate. With my money, my mother laughed. She'd never kick us out. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Once we're there, she won't do anything. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to my parents plan how to gut my life and call it love. 15 minutes. 20. By the time the call finally disconnected, my hand was cramped from gripping the phone so tightly. I felt sick. My stomach churned like I'd swallowed nails. I replayed their words in my head. over and over. She's a burden. She never kick us out. She owes us. In that silence, something in me shifted. I'd always been the good daughter. The reliable one. The ATM in disguise, but sitting there in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd paid for. The kitchen they were planning to gut for themselves. I knew this version of me couldn't survive any longer. I wiped my eyes. I picked up my other phone and replayed the call, and then hit record. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd come armed with receipts. Grandma Elizabeth once told me, "Don't let anyone decide what you're worth. You decide that for yourself." I finally understood what she meant. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I wasn't sick, not in the usual sense, but I was done pretending this was normal. I opened my laptop, poured myself a cup of the strongest coffee I could make, and typed in 3 words that would change everything. Can parents steal property? My name is Emma Davis. I'm 29 years old, and the house my grandmother left me, worth nearly $1 million, was supposed to be my sanctuary, my safe place. Instead, it became the stage for the biggest betrayal of my life. Funny how a place that once smelled like fresh pie and garden flowers could end up echoing with the sharp truth of how disposable I really was to the people who were supposed to love me the most. I'll never forget that day, the day my father forgot to hang up his phone. I was standing in the hallway, still holding my mug of lukewarm coffee, when I heard his voice clear as day, as if he was standing right behind me. "She's just a burden," he said to my mother, not realizing I was still on the line. They were sipping wine in Europe, posting pictures in front of castles, all paid for by me, while plotting how to turn the one thing that was truly mine into their retirement plan. That word burden rang in my ears like a slap. I felt something inside me crack wide open, so I did something they never expected. When they got back from their European vacation, smiling with souvenirs, planning to slip right back into the life they'd been bleeding dry, they found their keys didn't fit the lock anymore. The house was empty, and my note on the kitchen counter simply read, "Surprise, a burden did this." Before I tell you how I pulled it off, how I found the courage to finally stand up to the people who raised me, I want to know something. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? And if you've ever had to choose your own peace over family approval, hit that like button and subscribe. I promise you, you are not alone. Growing up, money was tight. My dad, Robert, was a factory worker, bitter about a million missed opportunities, or at least that's how he told it. My mom, Diana, worked as a receptionist on and off, but she mostly reminded me, every chance she got, that every meal I ate cost them something they could have spent on themselves instead. Home wasn't the warm, safe place it should have been. It was tense. Small arguments over bills. Bigger arguments about whose dreams had died, and whose fault that was, and me. I was the kid they constantly reminded was expensive, too expensive. But then there was my grandmother, Elizabeth. She was different. She'd invite me over to her big colonial house every other weekend. It felt like stepping into another world. The floors creaked in the best way, the walls were lined with books and old paintings, and the kitchen always smelled like something baking, cinnamon, or vanilla, depending on her mood. When I was a kid, I'd sit on the swing in her garden, and she'd kneel next to me, dirt on her gloves, whispering things my parents never did. "Emma, never let anyone tell you what you're worth. You decide that." She'd grown up poor too, but she'd built her own real estate portfolio from scratch after my grandfather died young. She was practical, shrewd, but warm. She never made me feel like I was a burden. She made me feel like an investment she believed in. When I turned 18, Grandma helped me fill out college scholarship applications. My parents refused to pay a dime for school. They said higher education was for people who thought they were better than everyone else. The truth was, my dad had never been accepted anywhere, and the sting of that was still raw decades later. I worked 3 jobs through college. I slept on borrowed couches some semesters when I couldn't make rent. But I made it a business degree and a job at a good real estate firm right after graduation. My grandmother sat front row when I crossed that stage, clapping like I'd won an Oscar. My parents, they complained about the parking. Then came the day that changed everything. Grandma Elizabeth died suddenly when I was 25. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I was grieving my biggest supporter, my safe place. I would have given anything to have her back. At the reading of her will, my parents sat on either side of me, squeezing my hand like they were the grieving, loving family. But the second the attorney said she'd left the house, her beloved house at 1842 Magnolia Drive, to me. Their faces darkened like a storm rolling in. The property at 1842 Magnolia Drive, valued at approximately $850,000, I leave to my granddaughter Emma Davis, who has shown the determination and responsibility to appreciate its value. Her words, and my parents. They got a modest cash inheritance which they blew on a new car and electronics within months. The day the deed officially transferred to my name, I felt two things at once: gratitude and a dread I couldn't quite name. Because from that moment, they never once called it my house. It became the family home. They dropped hints about where we should renovate the kitchen. When I pushed back, they'd brush me off. Family doesn't have boundaries, Emma. Somehow, that lack of boundaries only ever worked in one direction. They didn't pitch in for taxes, insurance, or repairs. That was all me. And when I decorated my living room, carefully choosing colors I loved, my dad would walk through and say, "This pink, it's not really to my taste." It was exhausting, but they always kept me on a tight leash of guilt. "Your grandmother would want us all to benefit," they'd say. Deep down, I still craved their approval. I wanted to believe we could be the family grandma always hoped we'd be. Then they announced they were going to Europe, a 3-month vacation they'd always dreamed about. My dad dropped it at Sunday dinner like it was nothing. "We'll just use the equity in the house." "You mean my house?" I asked, my fork pausing midair. "The house that's only in my name." "Don't be selfish, Emma," my mother scolded. "Your grandmother would want this for us." I said no to the loan, but like an idiot, I offered to help cover some of the trip so they could finally see the places they'd always talked about. Before I knew it, some turned into most. Flights, hotels, extra spending cash. I drained my savings to make them happy. They left for Paris without a thank you, and I stayed behind, paying the property taxes they never once offered to help with. I thought that was the worst it could get, that my big sacrifice would earn me at least a little bit of respect when they got home. I had no idea that the truth, the betrayal, was waiting just around the corner. One accidental phone call away from blowing my whole life wide open.